Once upon a time, rugby league wasn't built for highlights or headlines. It was built for survival. The middle of the field was a battleground, and fear was just another tactic. In that era, rules were loose, collisions were personal, and respect wasn't given for skill. It was taken through pain. This is the story of a man who didn't just play in that world, he embodied it. A man whose presence made opponents hesitate, made teammates stand taller, and forced the game itself to eventually change. This is not a highlight reel. This is a warning from rugby league's darkest, hardest era. Meet the scariest enforcer in NRL history, Steve Blocker Roach. Before the NRL learned how to sell itself, before concussion protocols, bunker reviews and player welfare statements, there was another version of rugby league, a violent one. A version that didn't pretend to be safe and didn't care who survived as long as the jersey did. This was rugby league when fear was part of the strategy, and pain was just another tool. And right in the middle of that chaos stood Steve Blocker Roach. This isn't nostalgia talking. This isn't exaggeration from old heads. This is the truth of an era where intimidation mattered more than stats, and front rowers weren't judged by meters gained but by how much damage they caused. Casual fans today watch clips and think it's all hype. What they miss is the context. When Steve Roach was on the field, the middle of the park didn't belong to both teams. It belonged to him. The 1980s and early 1990s were not about finesse. They were about territory, dominance, and psychological warfare. Front rowers were weapons. Their job was to absorb punishment, dish it back harder, and make the opposition question whether the next carry was worth it. If you didn't enjoy contact, you didn't last. If you didn't intimidate, you got targeted. Steve Roach didn't just survive in that environment, he thrived. He became the standard. When people talk about the violent era of rugby league, they're talking about players like him, whether they realize it or not. Physically, Roach was terrifying. Short, stocky, absurdly thick through the chest and shoulders, with a low center of gravity that made him almost impossible to stop cleanly. He didn't glide across the field or look for space. He ran straight, every time, directly at the strongest part of the defensive line. This wasn't poor vision. This was intent. One defender didn't stop him. Two barely slowed him. Three meant chaos in the ruck. And the worst part for defenders wasn't the hit. It was knowing it was coming and still being unable to stop it. Roach hunted contact. He wanted the collision. That mindset broke teams long before the scoreboard did. Balmain Tigers signed Roach in 1982, and the club's personality shifted almost instantly. They didn't just gain a prop, they gained an identity. Balmain became a side you had to fight before you could beat. Roach moved quickly into first grade and became the emotional core of the team. Between 1982 and 1992, he played 185 first grade games for the Tigers. That's a decade of punishment. When Balmain were under pressure, Roach took the ball. When tempers flared, Roach stepped forward. When someone needed to answer a challenge, Roach didn't hesitate. He wasn't just a forward. He was structure, presence, and intimidation rolled into one. By the late 1980s, Balmain's forward pack was feared across the competition. Steve Roach, Paul Soronen, Benny Elias and Wayne Pearce formed one of the strongest packs club rugby league has ever seen. They didn't rely on trick plays or finesse. They dominated the ruck, bent defensive lines backwards, and turned games into endurance tests. The 1989 season should have been their moment. Balmain powered into the grand final against Canberra and led 12-1 at halftime. The middle was controlled. Canberra were being worn down. Then came the decision that still hurts Tigers fans. Late in the second half, Roach and Soronen were taken off. The game went into extra time. They couldn't return. Without their muscle, Canberra surged and won 19-14. That loss wasn't just tactical. It showed exactly how much influence Roach had. When he wasn't there, everything changed. Roach debuted for New South Wales in the State of Origin in 1984 and immediately became a fixture. 17 Origin appearances followed, played during the most hostile period the series has ever seen. This was origin before restraint. Punch-ups were normal. Cheap shots were accepted. Intimidation was currency. Roach didn't need to throw punches to dominate. His presence alone forced Queensland to adjust. Hookers rushed passes when he charged. Forwards braced early, knowing contact was inevitable. At one point, legendary coach Jack Gibson reportedly threatened to resign if Roach was selected. Not because he lacked ability, but because he was uncontrollable. Yet when Roach played, New South Wales won. Fear, when aimed correctly, worked. Roach earned his Australian debut in 1985 and became a regular across tests, World Cups and Kangaroo Tours. These weren't ceremonial caps. They were earned through damage. Tours were brutal, long and relentless. Injuries followed him everywhere. A dislocated elbow interrupted his 1986 tour. Suspensions and citations followed later. Then came the infamous 1991 clash with New Zealand forward Dean Lonergan. The two collided heads. Roach needed 20 stitches. Lonergan collapsed on the turf, convulsing. Both returned to the game. That moment perfectly captured the era. Nobody questioned whether they should continue. The only concern was how fast they could get back on the field. 1990, Brookvale Oval, Balmain versus Manly. Roach was sent off for back-chatting referee Eddie Ward. As he walked from the field, he patted the referee on the head. Patronising, deliberate. Then he verbally abused the torch judge on his way off. 4-week suspension. Today, that moment would end careers. Back then, it became mythology. It wasn't just disrespect, it was dominance taken too far. Roach didn't just challenge players, he challenged authority itself, and the game barely kept him in check. Violence always demands payment. Roach's body eventually broke down. A knee injury wiped out most of his 1987 season. A suspension cost him the 1988 finals, including a grand final. By 1991 and 1992, ankle and knee injuries piled up. Enforcers don't fade gracefully. They break. Roach's final seasons weren't glamorous, but his presence still mattered. Even diminished, he steadied a Balmain side that needed leadership as much as muscle. That's the cost of being built for war. Retirement didn't soften him. Roach wrote his autobiography Doing My Block and moved into media. Commentary suited his bluntness, but controversy followed. Arguments with colleagues, sackings, radio stints, TV returns. In 2014, he was dismissed from radio following a bullying complaint. In 2016, he was back again. Steve Roach has never been a man who disappears quietly. Despite everything, recognition came. He received the Australian Sports Medal in 2000. He was named one of Australia's 100 greatest players during the NRL centenary. Decades later, his name still carries weight, not because he was perfect, but because he was real. Modern rugby league is faster, cleaner, and safer, but it exists because the old version pushed itself too far. Players like Steve Roach forced the game to evolve, forced rules to change, forced administrators to confront the cost of unchecked violence. He didn't just dominate his era, he exposed its limits. That's why his name still lands differently. Steve Blocker Roach wasn't just the scariest enforcer in NRL history. He was the embodiment of rugby league's hardest era, and the game is still living with what men like him made it become. Steve Blocker Roach wasn't built for the modern game. The modern game was built because of him. So if this story made you see rugby league differently, if it made you realise how brutal this sport once was, and how much it cost the players who lived in that era, hit subscribe, because this channel doesn't just show highlights, it tells the stories behind them. Drop a comment with the hardest enforcer you've ever seen, and stay tuned, because the next story goes even deeper into the violence that shapes the game.